Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org.
This week we're sharing Ian's talk with cartoonist Michael DeForge about the intersection of organizing and art. The conversation touches on Michael's recent organizing efforts in solidarity with Mskwaasin Agnew, who is among those detained by Israel as part of the Flotilla to bring aid to Gaza. They also discuss the good and the bad of instructive political stories, and Michael shares details about his upcoming collection from Drawn and Quarterly, scheduled for release in early 2026. But first, we're sharing an interview that Outlaw Podcast did with Jazz from the support crew for Xinacthli. Xinacthli is a Chicano anarchist who's been serving a 50-year sentence since 1996 for aggravated assault, and now nearly 30 years into his sentence, 22 of which have been in solitary confinement, according to his website. He's suffering accumulated health issues. During a collapse of his health, he was moved to the infirmary, but he's been denied any treatment, diagnosis, or access to his medical records. While in the infirmary, he had his personal items from his cell thrown away, including his commissary card, so he can't access extra food that he might want. The demands for Xinacthli are simple, and you can find the numbers and these demands in our show notes, but basically, 1, there's a request for people to call and put pressure on the TDCJ and McCConnell unit for his demands. 2, they're asking organizations to sign onto the demand letter to TDCJ, and the link is in the show notes. 3, there is a request for people to join the December 13th protest in Austin, Texas, which is passed now. And 4, donate to the campaign to support legal expenses. So check out the show notes again if you want to find the details to that.
My name is Jazz, and I am an organizer based in Houston, Texas, and I am one of the facilitators of the Xinacthli Freedom Campaign, which is a campaign dedicated to the liberation of revolutionary Chicano political prisoner Xinacthli, formerly known as Alvaro Hernandez. As I mentioned, Xinacthli is a political prisoner from Texas. He is currently serving a 50-year prison sentence in the McConnell unit, which is in Beeville, Texas, about 45 minutes outside of Corpus Christi, where he has been in solitary confinement for the last 23 years. He's currently 73 years old, and I'm here today to talk about his critical medical conditions and our work right now to try to get him transferred out of the McConnell unit and eventually transferred and released from incarceration completely.
So tell me about those medical conditions.
So as I mentioned, Xinacthli is 73 years old, so he's an elder. He was actually incarcerated into his middle age as a result of the abuse and neglect of Texas prisons and all prisons. Xinacthli's health has, deteriorated over the years from a lack of nutrition, lack of recreation, and just aging. And so in the last few months, this has really escalated. And a couple of weeks ago, he has been increasingly experiencing falls and having a more difficult time walking, standing, and also using the bathroom by himself. He fell a couple of times in the shower while trying to wash himself, and the second time he fell and hit his head pretty hard on the ground and resulted in him being taken to the infirmary, where he is currently in the infirmary, where he has not received any sort of diagnosis of what his actual medical condition is. He has also talked to us about tingling in his hands and feet, potentially having some other kind of unclear medical condition that is underlying, that has caused this very rapid decline in his health, but that we're not totally sure what it is right now.
Wow. How can those of us on the outside support him in getting the care he needs?
So right now, we are really trying to get people to call and put pressure on the prison to meet a couple of immediate demands. The most immediate demand that he has is that actually after he was taken to the medical infirmary inside of the McConnell unit, officers or wardens, apologies, went into his cell and threw away a lot of his personal items. They threw away food items, papers, pens, and in that process also threw away or lost his commissary card. And so they have been preventing him from purchasing anything from commissary, which he uses commissary to buy materials to write letters, as well as buying hygiene items that he needs, soap, toothpaste, things like that. And he also needs his commissary card to buy food to supplement his diet because they give him nothing but gruel, is what he calls it, while he's in prison. Even as he's experiencing these medical issues, they're not supplementing his diet with any fruits or vegetables or any sort of food that would help him get better. So he really relies on commissary to be able to meet these various needs, and he has been prevented from doing that for almost a week now. The other demands that we have is we would like him to be immediately medically released to a hospital unit in Galveston so that he can see immediate medical attention for the severity of the health issues that he's experiencing right now before being transferred more long term to the LeBlanc Medical Facility in Beaumont, Texas, for him to be transferred permanently out of the McConnell unit. And so to do that, people can email. We have emails for the facility, and we also have phone numbers that people can call to put pressure on the facility to meet those demands.
Great. Thank you so much. And I will link all of that information in the show notes. I also am just wondering if you have any advice or thoughts on what people can expect who are calling this facility, especially people who maybe haven't called into a prison before.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. So the primary goal of calling and emailing the prison is as agitation. We know that the McConnell unit does not have any interest in helping Xinacthli get healthy, or that they're going to change their mind just because they have goodwill. They're only going to respond to public pressure. And so calling is really just to apply that pressure. They are going to be agitated with you. They're not going to want to share information with you. The importance is just we have a script that we provide to call, to read the demands, and just to keep calling, sharing, getting other people to call, because the more people are bothering them about this issue, the more that they realize that we're not going to go away until they resolve some of these problems and meet some of our demands. And that is really the leverage that phone blasts and email blasts provide. But we will also be planning some other forms of escalation that people could get involved in the next month. And another way that people can support Xinacthli is just through fundraising. We sell posters and t-shirts, but we also just accept donations, and those donations are going directly to helping his legal team do their work, and also for organizing expenses.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And for listeners who don't know, these call-in campaigns actually are really effective with people who are inside. Sometimes it feels like you're calling into a void, but I feel like I've just seen a number of times this really like turnaround results for people. So just a plug
Yeah.
to actually do it.
One example, so in our original demands, and as this situation progresses, things are moving really quickly. Every single day, we're getting new updates from him and from what we're doing in the campaign. So one of our first demands was to restore his communication, because when he was first moved to the infirmary, he had no access to communication to call anyone, to call his lawyer, to call folks on the campaign. And so through calling and putting pressure on the prison, the warden actually delivered a brand new tablet to Xinacthli to restore his communications to folks outside. So to what you're saying, the phone blasts really do have an impact. It seems small, but it really is impactful.
So there's an action item you can do today and actually really make a material difference in someone's life. Thank you so much for coming on to share this update. Is there anything you want to add before we wrap up?
Just please follow us on Free Xinacthli Now on Instagram. Like I said, there are going to be continued updates and continued call to action over the next month or months as we try to get him transferred and get some of these demands met. So please keep up with us and reach out if you have any questions.
For people who might be going to open their Instagram right now to type in your handle, do you want to spell Xinacthli's name for me?
Yeah, so that's free, and then Xinachtli is Xinachtli. So free Xinachtli now.
The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Hello, Inman here from Strangers in a Tangled Wilderness, an anarchist publishing collective that's been putting out work for over 20 years. We just put out a new book, and we think you're really going to like this one. Orso, Wartime Journals of an Anarchist, contains the first-person narrative of Lorenzo Orsetti, also known as Heval Tekosher Peling, now Shahid Tekosher, an internationalist soldier in Rojava. Orso's journals were originally published in their native Italian following his death, and we have the great honor of publishing the first English edition. It's through our devotion to each other that we, all of us, live forever. This memoir is a story of the everyday bravery that not only defeated the Islamic State, but proved that a better world is possible and within our grasp. That's what Margaret Killjoy had to say about the book. What will you say about it? If you want a sneak peek for free, you can read the essay Martyr Culture by Sarah Bloom, which accompanies and helps contextualize Orso's journals. You can also hear an audio feature of the essay, as well as my interview with Sarah about her essay on the Strangers in a Tangled Wilderness podcast, or Live Like the World is Dying. Find it all at tangledwilderness.org. And remember, every storm begins with a single raindrop. Try to be that raindrop. Orso.
I am here with artist and activist, if you think that's fair, Michael DeForge. Michael, can you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure, yeah. My name's Michael. I use he, him pronouns. I work as a cartoonist in Toronto, and my practice involves both drawing comic books, but also different forms of commercial illustration. And I do some amount of organizing here in Toronto as well. Most recently as part of the No Arms in the Arts campaign, which is a coalition of different culture sector organizations that have been mobilizing around art sponsorships or arts institutions with ties to Israel's genocide. So just sort of whether it's weapons companies within Israel or weapons companies implicated in the murder of Palestinians, or if it's companies that sponsor the arts or have ties to the arts that have other types of affiliations within Israel as well, including, for instance, donating to IOF affiliated groups or Israeli settler groups, settler construction on sort of illegal settlements, that sort of thing.
Thank you very much. So I reached out to you based on some social media posts from earlier this month. You and others were recently arrested for an action, and I was wondering if you could put that into a little bit of context for listeners, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Sure. I mentioned this to you before, but I have to be a little bit vague about the details because these are for charges that are still ongoing, and it's charges that include a number of other people who aren't me. So I have to be, intentionally a little bit vague and use a lot of very, goofy kind of allegedlys when talking about it. But I can give at least some of the context, which was earlier in the month, one of the boats that was part of the wave of freedom flotillas on the way to try to break the siege on Gaza included a boat that had 5 Canadian citizens out of the wave that included the global Samud flotilla. There were actions in response, specifically here in Toronto. There was demands around one of the flotilla members who was kidnapped by Israel and held within an Israeli prison, Mskwaasin Agnew. Because she lives in Toronto, one of the actions, I guess, allegedly involved a occupation at the member of parliament who would technically be her elected representative. And the demands also included that this was a member of parliament named Karim Bardisi, and there have also been demands that because he's a member of the Liberal Party, the Liberal Party is currently the ruling party in Canada, that Canada also implement arms embargo with Israel. Mskwaasin, I can also say, is a comrade. I can't say I know her very well, but I know her around because she does a lot of work in harm reduction circles. So I sort of know her through harm reduction work and other types of organizing I've been involved with. There were 19 arrests across a span of 24 hours related to actions kind of triggered by Israel's kidnapping of Mskwaasin. And that also included, it was 5 different Canadians who were detained by Israel and held in an Israeli prison where, in the weeks since, we've heard all sorts of accounts about the types of treatment and torture that all the Flotilla members went through, which is what those prisons specialize in because it's the type of mistreatment and torture that they subject Palestinian prisoners to on a daily basis. So yeah, there's a bunch of us and we're facing criminal charges. And yeah, just because the charges are ongoing, that's about as much as I can say about it. But I did post about it on social media just because I happened to have a reading event in Buffalo the next day. And I was basically advised by a lawyer that I shouldn't, even though it's sort of an ongoing criminal charge, I shouldn't risk trying to cross the border to America, just given the situation right now. And needed to explain to the store and the people who were hoping to come to the reading and the other artists I was reading with and all that sort of thing about why I wouldn't be there the following evening.
Thank you very much. Are you able to speak to Mskwaasin's current status?
Yeah, thankfully she is back, and she's talked a little bit about it on social media. But yeah, thankfully she is back and she is safe back in Toronto. Yeah.
So, in general, can you talk about the response and the actions you've seen in Toronto organizing spaces and around this genocide in Gaza, and maybe talk about how you feel the state has responded?
Yeah, there's been, I'd say, like maybe 130, 150 arrests. In terms of criminal charges, I would guess, yeah, like lots of cases where one person will be charged with multiple counts, but I would guess somewhere around 150 plus criminal charges total. Very few of them have resulted in convictions. A lot of them just get thrown out, but the state here has been basically going through using these charges both as a way, like the arrests result in a lot of injuries. So aside from the violence of the arrests themselves and the way they shut down actions, the state, despite the fact that they don't come with very many criminal convictions, have been using them as a way to drain the movement of resources. So a lot of the times you can kind of assume that the city doesn't think anything will come with the charges, but they know it'll be months, in some cases a year plus, where the person being charged will be tied up in legal fees. They'll be tied up in, just these things take a lot of time. There's a big time commitment. A lot of charges are publicized in a way where it's specifically designed to get arrestees' names out there in a way that jeopardizes both their privacy, but also, in a lot of cases, their livelihood. That's sort of been a big part of it. And a lot of the charges come with bail conditions that do make it a lot more difficult to either organize or participate in, any number of forms of civil or uncivil disobedience, I guess I'll say, where the bail conditions, I sometimes there'll be non-association bail conditions. Sometimes there'll be bail conditions specifically prohibiting people from being in certain areas. Sometimes there are bail conditions around protests themselves. A lot of these are technically violations of Canadian charter rights. Not that I put a lot of credence to our charter rights or the state's interest in enforcing them, but it's just to say that it's a really like a punishment by process thing. Around 5 years ago, I was criminally charged with something that the charges have been dropped, so I can talk more freely about it. And it was a big instance of a punishment by process sort of thing, where I was part of about a dozen people charged with over an action disrupting railway infrastructure in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en land defenders. And we were able to beat the charges, but of course it just comes with being tied up in all of these other ways. And we had, at that point, we had a certain set of bail conditions, and we had to fight the bail conditions and go through this whole process. So it's very common to see this with Project Resolute. Project Resolute is sort of the name that Toronto police has been using to investigate anything related to Palestine whatsoever. And it's technically under the hate crimes unit, but aside from just how racist that is, that like anything in solidarity with Gaza would be considered a potential hate crime, none of the charges or investigations that Project Resolute has carried out have actually successfully even resulted in a hate crime charge, which just maybe speaks to how spurious this whole operation is.
Sure. Kind of maybe taking a broader view, it sounds to me like you have been organizing for years. Is there much overlap in your organizing circles and the circles in which you practice your artwork?
At the moment, there is more than usual. I would say just I mentioned the No Arms in the Arts campaign, but yeah, around Palestine, culture sector organizing has become a lot of the organizing work I've been doing, which hasn't always been the case. I've been in groups that have been totally unrelated to culture sector stuff, but yeah, right now I'm a member of the Toronto chapter of a group called Writers Against the War on Gaza, which as a group we are members of the No Arms in the Arts Coalition. But a lot of the no arms work, I mentioned the campaign is specifically around arts institutions that usually have like corporate or charitable sponsors with ties to the genocide. A lot of that has been trying to move artists in a way where artists see themselves as political actors, or artists see themselves as workers and are trying to leverage that in certain ways. Because I think there's frequently an assumption that the only way artists can engage with quote unquote politics is through their art, like making art about something they feel strongly about, which I think is great. People should do that, of course. But a lot of the campaign has been about like, okay, well, how do you actually like situate yourself in this broader industry, and what leverage do you have in this industry? And a question that we frequently pose is that like clearly, in this case, Zionist interests, but more broadly corporate interests, find art a valuable space. The reason why there are these corporate sponsorships or rich billionaire philanthropists sponsor the arts, it's not out of the good of their heart, right? Like they're getting something out of it. So how do we use that against them? And what is it that they're getting out of it? And how can we sort of push back on that and make art spaces something where we feel like we have more agency and ownership and control over? So yeah, so lately I have been more involved in organizing conversations with, my peers, whether it's filmmakers, musicians, authors, all sorts. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your early life and some of the formative experiences that brought you to art making, and maybe talk about if these were the same or in conjunction with the experiences that brought you to, I guess, political awareness?
In terms of art, I had always been reading comics ever since I was a kid. My parents had different comic strip collections just around the house when I was growing up. So that would include The Far Side, Calvin and Hobbes, Peanuts, Bloom County. As I got older, I got into superheroes. And then kind of in high school and my 20s, over that course of 10, 15 years, I started to realize that comics were more than just superheroes or comic strips, and got into different, found out about manga, found out about alternative comics, that sort of thing. A lot of that too was happening at the same time I was getting into punk and sort of DIY music circles, and saw a lot of art that included comics, but even just posters, design, that was a lot different from art I'd seen before and made in sort of a different tradition. So like a lot of art that came out of the noise scene at the time I was a teenager became a big influence on me. And that would include artists from the sort of Fort Thunder scene collective and people just sort of more broadly associated with that. It's like Matt Brinkman, Brian Chippendale, etc. In terms of politics, like some of that happened around the same time, but not, I feel like that I didn't have any kind of one awakening. I sometimes get the like what radicalized you question from either interviewers or just friends. And it's sort of funny where it wasn't really like one thing. It was just sort of, I would say that punk was probably just like through zines or whatever, that was my introduction to a lot of political ideas that I hadn't really engaged with before. I was raised in a pretty like milquetoast, like vaguely progressive left liberal household. And it was sort of through zines that I got introduced to different ideas and different conflicting ideas. And just gradually I kept, like the sort of flip answer that I give is like, I kept reading books until I became a communist, but that's not actually that far from what actually happened, which is a sort of a gradual thing where I'd be reading, I'd be talking to people, those people would argue with me and maybe change my mind about something. I try to put some of those politics to practice and they'd get developed more, or, there's a very gradual arc and one that I hope isn't over. I sort of feel like political development ideally is like a lifelong thing. So yeah, I didn't really have like, with comics, I had all these big like thunderbolt moments where I was like, wow, I've never seen anything like this before. But I would say with politics, it's been more gradual.
You were kind of steeped in it. It sounds like you were steeped in it in situations where it was kind of came to you through osmosis. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. Like osmosis, and I would say just sort of like getting more active, really like put a lot of things that I had thought about in theory to, like the rubber hits the road when you're actually in the thick of something. So I feel like there's no substitute for political education that actually comes from the really unglamorous work of, trying to move people or working on infrastructure or being involved in planning and direct action and all the really kind of like awful, boring or excruciating stuff. I feel like that kind of is where I learned the most.
Would you say that as far as kind of mentorship or instruction, that mostly came from peer groups on the scene?
Yeah, I would say that. Like just a lot of comrades kind of across I would say across the political spectrum, but I mean across the left spectrum, just who, yeah, I do think that I have benefited a lot from, learning from organizers, especially who have been organizing in different contexts, and I can learn from that, or organizing kind of the sort of generational knowledge I get from people who've been kind of in the weeds much longer than I have.
So I follow you on social media and on Patreon, and it seems like a lot of your recent output, in addition to comics, is flyers and posters promoting events. Now I understand that has always kind of been a factor of your practice. I was particularly struck by the series you've been doing on Asian action cinema. I think that I saw a hard-boiled poster. The way that you put these together, they seem very reflexive in their composition, and I was wondering if you mainly put those together kind of off the cuff.
It kind of depends. Sometimes a poster comes together really quickly. Sometimes I go through like 30, 40 variations. And usually the stuff that seems simplest is the stuff I have to fiddle around with the most. I think when I go for a very maximalist composition, you're just sort of filling the page. So you can just trust like, right, it's going to be busy, it's going to be loud, this sort of big, full, detailed drawing. But when something only has a few elements, I feel like it's almost tougher because you have to really nail those few elements, where if you have 30 different things going on in a composition, it's like, well, it's fine if a few of them are not exactly perfect. But Yeah, I do like doing the film posters a lot. Posters have just always been a very large part of my practice, where like when I started drawing, I was making zines in high school, but I was also doing a lot of gig posters. I was inspired a lot by a few specific poster artists from the punk and DIY and noise scenes at the time, and was trying to do posters myself. And just, I had a crappy high school silk screening rig where I was like exposing screens out of a pizza box and trying to like print in my closet, like literally a closet, because it was the place where I could get like pitch black. And I kind of cut my teeth like learning to make posters then, and did a lot of gig posters. And I still do the odd music poster, but for whatever reason, I get tapped to do music less. And now most of my posters are either for film, like usually a lot of like repertory type screenings, independent cinema screenings, and political posters like agitprop. I like making propaganda for there's like a few artists in Toronto who kind of have the agitprop beat, I guess, and I would be one of them. So yeah, posters remain a big part of what I do, and I do think a thing that I like about it, in addition to just maybe poster art always having been a big influence on me, is it's an excuse to try out different styles and design solutions a little bit. I think all of my posters, for all purposes, are very clearly recognizably done by me. But when you're working with like a filmmaker's like vision, or you're working with a band or something, you are having to do this thing of figuring out like this can't just be the Michael show. I have to like actually communicate something about this other work I'm interacting with, whether it's like music or movie. And that's the same with agitprop, is like my design preferences or aesthetic preferences are still going to come through, but in a lot of cases they have to be secondary, or at least negotiate with like, okay, who is this actually trying to speak to? Is it my inclination is always to do work that is extremely hard to read. I like illegible lettering and illegible typography, because that's some of the scene I came out of. You see that in like punk and noise and metal writing. But when you are, say, working on a piece of propaganda, you don't want it to be illegible, right? You want someone to be able to see it across the street and clock it and read it. So yeah, I like having all of these considerations. I like thinking of design problems and design solutions. Yeah.
Where do these things overlap and where do they diverge? So, like, what are the differences between making a flyer and a mini comic and a book? Like, I'm sure that you have different short-term goals, but I wonder, I guess, if you start from the same creative place.
It depends a little. My comics are very much their own thing. And I think of my comics as a little bit different from, or I think of my comics as very different from my commercial work, right? I do sort of set a bit of a boundary where my comics are, like I have editors and I have a publisher right now, and I'll take their input and I talk to them. But for the most part, like I control everything in my comics, and I really like that. I like controlling every aspect of the writing and the art, and as much as I can, aspects of the design. And once you get to like stuff like production, you start to lose control. But for the most part, I get to like handle everything and just indulge all of my creative whims entirely. Yeah, I like being a control freak in that context. And then for work, that's commercial work. Even though I enjoy, doing posters for like an independent screening series, it's still a work for hire gig. And in those cases, I have to answer to the person who I'm working for. And then I do commercial gigs for people that I don't always like their input. Like usually if I'm doing something for a screening series, it's like someone I'm cool with or someone I know a little or whatever. And then, sometimes it goes to, I do animation work, and I know The animation work has been for people I've worked with for a few years, really enjoy working with. But then, I move on to like magazine editorial work, and sometimes I don't really love the magazine, or I don't really love the art director, and on and on and on, just the range of freelance. And I've been doing it long enough that I know a little bit when to put up a fight, certainly if it comes to like my not being paid or my being mistreated in some way, I'll put up a fight. But in terms of like creative decisions, I have a pretty clear idea of like, okay, this is a hill to die on, or this isn't. Like I'm not ultimately the guy who gets to decide something in some of these cases. And I know sometimes I just have to like put my ego aside and put out something that maybe I wouldn't be super happy with. But luckily, like, I don't get a lot of those gigs as much anymore. I get less high profile gigs than I used to anyway. So most of the freelance work I do, thankfully, even if I kind of like the financial security of a few of the higher paying gigs I used to get, it's usually like working with people where they kind of know my work already, and the reason they're working with me is because they want to see me kind of do my thing. So yeah, I do kind of treat them as separate, but there's obviously some bleed over, because stuff like the political propaganda, like I'm not getting paid for that. It's not exactly personal work, it exists in some weird medium, and there's certainly lots of like weird bleed that happens, but for the most part I do separate the two.
Okay. From the perspective of the stuff that you have total control over, do you tend to let the project lead the way, or do you tend to go into it with some goals?
I usually have some, goals is maybe like a little too lofty, but I tend to have an idea of what the shape of a project will be. And then from there, I improvise a lot of the writing. So I'll usually have a premise in mind, and maybe the big themes, or maybe a sense of like who the lead character is and maybe where I want to take them. But I try to only have a pretty rough skeleton of what I want to say or what I'm trying to do, and then give myself a lot of room to improvise. That's the most clear I've done a few comics at this point that have started out as comic strip serials. Ant Colony, Styx Angelica, Leaving Richards Valley, and Birds of Maine have all been comics I've done that were originally either weekly or daily strips. And in those cases, I kind of had a sense of what the comic would be about. The most recent of that set was called Birds of Maine, and it was about this like utopian bird society that lived on the moon. And a lot of the planning I did was mostly just shaping some of the principles the bird society would live around, because I wanted it to be utopian and a reflection of some of my own politics. But I also really like the Ursula Le Guin thing of an ambiguous utopia, so I didn't want it to necessarily say it had all the answers. So I just wanted to like kind of map it out a little. And then once I had this sort of shape of the world, I knew, all right, I can just elaborate on it as much as I can. And I have these characters, and they'll go on journeys, and I don't need to know exactly the journey they'll go on. And I'm talking about utopian bird technology, and I have some idea of how it worked. I made all the bird technology revolve around like mushrooms and fungal networks and stuff, but it's like I don't need to know all of it. That can come as I write. And then even for like smaller stories, like stories that are smaller in scope, it'll be similar. Like my last book that came out earlier this year is called Holy Lacrimony, and it was about an alien abduction. And it kind of emerged from another comic idea that I ended up scrapping. But I knew that the book was going to be two halves from the start. I knew half of it was going to be the protagonist on the alien spaceship, and then the other half was going to be the protagonist in a UFO support group back on Earth. And I didn't need to have all the details sorted out. I just knew that this was the structure of it, and then could kind of trust the book to It's almost like I had a bag and I was like just like filling the bag until the shape formed or something. That was the worst analogy I could have given, but I sort of trust that it would fill out,
Yeah. So I'm just kind of basing this on how much of your work seems to be in collaboration, but I get the impression that you're an extrovert. And I think that you maybe touched on this a little bit earlier, but is making art something that you associate with being in community, or is it something that you do in private and bring into your community?
I, it's funny. I don't think of myself as particularly extroverted. I think of myself as my tendencies are maybe introvert tendencies. Not that I put a lot of thought into
Sure.
extrovert versus introvert, but left to my own devices, like I really like just working in my room alone, watching movies, listening to music, drawing comics. But I feel like all these other things in my life kind of like pull me out of it, and for good reason, because like even though my personal comfort might tend towards being alone more than I actually am, there are things that I value more than comfort, and that includes my community and friendships and relationships I have in my community. It also includes like political commitments. Like I don't a lot of the things that are like kind of a part of leftist activity, I guess. Like whether it's organizing, whether it's direct action, like whatever you might say, it's not stuff I am particularly like inclined towards, or stuff that I necessarily feel that comfortable with or found intuitive. Like conflict, like whether it's conflict with people within a circle or people outside. Like I used to think of myself as very conflict averse, but now I just sort of am okay with it, and that just came from like experience. And that's the same with like a lot of things. Like I don't think strategically naturally, but I sometimes have been forced to think about strategy. Same with like a lot of the kind of like day to day, the formal and informal day to day infrastructure that is required to keep communities going, whether it's like an arts community or a political community or something else.
Sure.
So yeah, and in terms of my art, like it's sort of a weird spectrum, because sometimes it's another thing where maybe I do divide my comics and some of my other stuff a lot more, where my comics I do feel like I make it on my own and then I bring it to other people, and there's a bit of interplay with that, because a lot of the time, I am in conversation with other cartoonists and friends who aren't who aren't authors or cartoonists or artists, and we're talking about ideas a lot, and I feel like that stuff makes it to the page, and like the work I'm doing is still in dialogue with my friends, with my community, with my peers, especially like, my partner is a cartoonist, like my best friend is a cartoonist. We talk about comics all the time, and we're always just sort of bouncing ideas off of each other. So even though I think of it as something where like I'm in control, I have final say, I'm doing it alone, all of these other things are brought into it, and that doesn't, of course, even account for all just the day-to-day experiences that get brought into a work all the time. And then there's work where it really is stuff that I see like maybe beholden or accountable to a community. So the agitprop being a big one, where it's like I don't like the idea of making quote unquote political art just as like a flight of fancy. Like I want it to actually be politically useful in some way. And I feel like that is work that I do where I do think of it as like accountable to the people around me. However you might, like not in like a, if I do something bad, they can like discipline me or something, but it's like more like, yeah, how is this useful to people? Like, how can I be of use?
And in that regard, do you mean anchored to like a campaign or an action or something like that?
Yeah, either like anchored to a campaign, or it doesn't even have to be as formal as a campaign necessarily, but like I don't like the idea of just sort of going out on my own and doing something if it's
Sure.
not something at least I'm a little bit engaged in, or have friends who are engaged in, or I feel like I do need to have some skin in the game a little bit. However that might look like. But yeah, like I don't really like the image of like the movement artist who is just sort of there dispensing art wisdom at a remove. Like I want to
Sure.
feel like I both want it to feel useful, and I want it to actually. I do feel like it's the responsibility of making art that way to be in communication with whether it's the communities it's affecting or whatever it might be.
Okay, thank you. Bit of a digression here. You cited Gary Larson's Far Side as an early interest. I wonder if that, still if those still kind of get to you. And I wonder if you saw the new cartoons he put out last week.
So I actually didn't see the new work until you mentioned it
Okay.
in your email, but like it delighted me when I did when I did see that. Yeah.
I bring it up just kind of in regard to kind of how it relates to a body of work, and I wonder if you choose projects and gigs with a larger body of work in mind.
At this point, I don't. I try to be a bit unprecious about what the larger body is going to look like. I don't think I was always that way. I think early on in my career, I had this idea of like what a career arc could look like. And now that I've been at it for so many years, I know that like a lot of careers just like take a lot of detours, and that's actually sometimes the more interesting thing when there are lots of detours. A lot of my work I do think of as at least like I come back to a lot of themes and ideas. Like community comes up a lot in my work, and I have a lot of books that are almost like pairs with each other in the way that I write about community, like Styx Angelica, Leaving Richards Valley, and Birds of Maine are all very explicitly about like my thinking through the way communities come together and sometimes break apart. Same with my new book, Holy Lacrimony. And then I also have a lot of work that I think of as like comics that are more about being stuck in my own head. And I'm talking about my own experience with mental illness and institutionalization. And I have a lot of work that like pairs that way, and work that's about technology, like work that's critiquing technology, like a Familiar Face and Birds of Maine are both sort of a dystopian and utopian vision of technological development that I think of as like a mirror in certain ways. So I think on the whole, like you can see me coming back to these ideas from different vantage points and visual ideas too. Like I'll come back around to visual ideas and hopefully with like a slightly different perspective each time. But in terms of sort of like this whole respectable body of work, I don't tend to think about it too much. A lot of my favorite artists, and that includes cartoonists, but it also includes like filmmakers or musicians, are ones who've worked in a lot of different formats and a lot of different genres across a lot of different tones. And I always find that like very interesting and the work that I'm most excited about. Even if it's artists where there's like that includes some amount of failure or like projects that kind of miss the mark or sort of silly throwaway things. I really like artists who are ambitious in that way. In terms of comics, like I think there's like Gilbert Hernandez is maybe I think the ultimate for that. Like both Hernandez brothers are great for that, but like Gilbert has done so much work that is like properly you could point to it as like this is a literary comic. You could pass it to someone in a bookstore. You could put it in the book review section of a reputable newspaper and it could win a bunch of literary prizes. But then he'll do another comic that is like as bizarre and abstract and aggressive as like something that would be incomprehensible to that same audience. And then he'll do something that's like a goofy sci-fi pastiche, or he'll do stuff that's like straight up porn, and it all kind of fits in this like larger Gilbert universe. But clearly, if he was someone who really cared about like, no, I'm just trying to like cater to this one market, he wouldn't be taking all these like zigs and zags that he does, but that would be a much less interesting body of work if it was all the one thing. And he would do great at just the one thing. And that, that extends to like a lot of, like I think of Johnny To as a filmmaker who I really love, who has worked in a lot of different genres and tones. Or like, Prince has been like a huge thing in my life since I was a kid. I love Prince. And when you look at Prince's body of work, I think now since he's passed, like there's more of an appreciation for eras of his career that at the time people thought of as like huge missteps for him, But like a thing I always appreciated is that he was unafraid to take like really big and weird swings throughout his career. So yeah, those are the sorts of bodies of work that I tend to be most attracted to.
Would you say that Gilbert speaks to you a little bit more on more of a deep level than Jaime does?
It's tough. Like both of them, I like love so much, and they're so part of like my DNA and like just the DNA of comics. But I'd say Gilbert is weird in a way that I think is closer to how I approach art. Because like Jaime's been such a big influence, but I think if you look at the DNA of my work, you'll see more Gilbert than Jaime, even though both of them have just like been huge for me. Because yeah, like I think when I first was engaging, and Jaime has taken a lot of similar swings, but like stuff like, especially recently, some of the most recent Gilbert comics are like so weird. They're like, I was thinking about like how hard it'd be to explain to somebody just like, here's what this book is about. Like it'd be so difficult, but like I love that, like it makes me so happy for how bracing they are. Like there's just some of the work I'm almost like, it's like he's antagonizing the reader, which delights me.
Have you had a chance to meet them?
Yeah, both of them are like just the nicest guys you'll ever meet, and both have been extremely generous and supportive and kind to me, especially like really early on in my career. I was really, like these guys are like living legends. So the fact that they gave me the time of day meant a lot. And I know they do the same to a lot of young cartoonists. So they are like the best.
Awesome. So I want to talk a little bit briefly as we kind of start to wind down. A lot of your past work, I feel, touches on the ecological, probably through a lens of the societal, whether that's natural ecology in works like Spotting Deer or the utopias you mentioned in Birds of Maine. Is there an ecological factor in your upcoming work? And I wonder what you are able to share, if anything, about All the Cameras in My Room coming out in 2026 from John and Quarterly.
It won't be as big a factor in All the Cameras in My Room, but I have two sort of smaller, or not smaller, one will be pretty large, but I have two projects on the go where that is a part of it. Again, for All the Cameras in My Room, it's a collection of short stories, and this one it ended up being a pretty dystopian collection, but a lot of it is about, I'd say half the stories are kind of engaging in mass culture in a certain way, sometimes in a critical way, sometimes just in a very silly way. And then the other half are very concerned with surveillance and performance. The kind of anchoring comic is a short story that I'd say I think it is the longest story in the collection. I'd say it's about 60 pages, where everything else is probably 10 to 20 pages. And it's a comic about someone who has infiltrated a leftist group on behalf of an unnamed law enforcement agency. And yeah, so it's like, I would say a little bit more on the pessimistic side. I have sometimes alternated between utopian comics and pessimistic comics. My last short story collection, Heaven No Hell, I'd say it was intentionally a bit of a mix, because I have Heaven and Hell in the title, both in the title, but I would say like a little towards the optimistic side. Like I tried to kind of have a lot of grace notes in that collection. And this one, I don't think I have much of that. I think it's a much bleaker comic. So I don't know what that says about me or my outlook or the world, but that's where that one is at. But yeah, in terms of like ecology and nature, it is something I keep coming back to. And I specifically like, I sometimes think we have this idea that like nature is something separate from us, or nature is something separate from technology, or nature is something separate from the man-made world, quote unquote. And a thing I have come back to in a lot of my comics is basically like, no, for better or worse, and oftentimes worse, like we're in it. If we're in a city, we are in nature. So like act accordingly, and figuring out ways to like look at those divisions or break down those divisions, I guess. So if there was one sort of overarching thing that would bind those comics together, it'd be that idea.
In kind of looking at your work, it seems like, the art and the politics kind of inform each other and kind of feed into each other. I wonder, this is probably too vague of a question, I can maybe hone in on a little bit, but what role do you feel culture plays in putting forth a politics, and what do you feel are the limitations there? There was a piece today in New Republic about protesters in Nepal and Madagascar using the One Piece anime and manga Jolly Roger flag as a symbol of their struggle. And I guess I just wonder what you make of stuff like that.
I mean, when I see stuff like that, like it's cool, but I also know to some extent, like when stuff is popular, that's going to be the thing that people like. That stuff is so hard to control. When stuff is popular, like people are going to kind of rally around it in ways that you can't really predict. Where there's been mass culture work that I've thought of as outright reactionary that has been used in like, leftist or liberatory movements. Like I didn't think the the politics of the Joker movie were particularly good. I thought it was.
Sure.
I would say it on the whole, it leaned towards either like the reactionary or the incoherent. But I would like you could see liberatory movements adopt that imagery. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the Matrix and the Wachowski sisters, like that, their politics is pretty explicit, even if I would argue that the Matrix's politics are pretty explicit, but certainly their politics are. They're two trans women that have, by not by any fault of their own, the concept of the red pill is like predominantly used by reactionary groups that like stand for everything they are against and very explicitly against. So there's just like an amount that's kind of like hard to control, right? So I think it's cool when I see that. And certainly mass culture like is able to shape what people see. I think there are ways sometimes mass culture can be a bit of a temperature check on like what conventional wisdoms might be, and then ways that mass culture shapes what people's political horizons might seem like, what might be politically possible. But yeah, within that, it's sort of like hard to predict. And I think a lot of the times too, culture, not just mass culture, gets used as a containment strategy and gets used as a way to either placate or co-opt or defang, whether it's radical ideas or radical movements. And sometimes it doesn't, that's like something I grapple with a lot in my practice, where if you're only ever engaging with things on the culture side, it's very easy for the ruling class to kind of like defang different types of dissent or neutralize it while still keeping the dissent there, because they've factored in all of the artistic forms of dissent. They've factored in the stand-up comedians making jokes. They've factored in like and you can see that in not just in mass culture, but like you can go to some of the biggest museums in the world, and they will be honoring and commemorating the same protest movements that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 50 years ago, they had a hand in criminalizing. And if they were around and active today, they would still have a hand in criminalizing.
Sure.
So, I think it's important. And movements need artwork. Like that's extremely important. Movements need artwork and creativity. But I try to like be very aware of the limits of that and the dangers of only ever engaging with some of these ideas on the cultural production side.
Okay, so in this upcoming book, you mentioned that one of the stories is about a leftist group that is infiltrated. What signifiers did you kind of give that group to make it explicit to the reader what that group represents?
The types of actions that I tried to not make it like, here's the exact type of anarchist or here's the exact type of communist they are, like
Sure.
Here's the adjective that precedes them, but the types of actions they engage in, I try to make it at least like a little bit explicit. But one of the this is like a very common thing that gets talked about, but like the way in left spaces you can act like a cop without being a cop. Like that was kind of the idea I was trying to engage with the most, is like the slippages we have in our language, the slippages we have in our behavior, and how that stuff implicates us in all of these ways. And I'll say it's supposed to be like a little satirical, like it's
Sure.
It's like maybe not like a joke a minute, but it's supposed to be a little bit funny and be a bit about how these spaces can sometimes self-sabotage themselves and doesn't only kind of needs the infiltrator to like push things along. And there's obviously like a ton of literature and a ton of zines about this sort of thing.
As a working artist based in Canada, especially as you pursue work in America, I wonder if you have anything that you might offer about the role that socialized healthcare that you receive in Canada, if it's been helpful in pursuing your art.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, it has been. And there's sometimes this thing of like when you're Canadian and you're talking to Americans, it's you default to this thing of like having to insist like, hey, Canada's awful. I know it's not as bad as America, but the socialized medicine, like it has been huge. It's been something where like even as bad as things get, that we do have a higher bare minimum. And that is a higher bare minimum that's not unique to Canada, right? Like the States is in many ways one of the odd men out in that it doesn't think of healthcare as like a basic irreducible minimum. And it's allowed me to make comics, like knowing that that's not something that, I still have to worry about my health and there's very dire economic consequences to my getting sick, but that I still have that as a safety net has been big. And another big thing too is that like there are still arts grants in Canada and they're getting cut. It's like they're in danger constantly. They're shrinking every year, but like I know there are grants in the States, but there are less. But like there are municipal, provincial, and federal arts grants in Canada, and they've been ones that I've been able to receive in the past. So like, there's like a lot of things like that where like it has made working as an artist here much, much easier than if I had the exact same career arc, but had it south of the border.
Sure. Okay. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
If you want to support radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various streaming platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.media. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce for each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Stripe, Venmo, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.media/support. Finally, if you'd like to hear us on your local radio station, visit tfsr.media/radio to find more info or reach out to us for some help. Thanks for listening. This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.